people up sometimes, and if they didn't talk the way he wanted them to, he would put them in jail behind him. And that was like a death sentence. And I was always afraid to go and get the pass, you know, to leave the ghetto and come back by 3 o'clock. But my father usually came with us, and I felt safer when he was there. Although he was scared too, he told me later.
The loss of freedom, the trampling of dignity, and the lack of food and medicine cast a shadow of death over the ghetto.
My grandmother died in March of 1943. She was 74 years old.
I have an uncle who passed away, my mother's brother, her youngest brother. I think he was 31 years old. And my grandmother, a couple of days later on her birthday, passed away as well, because he happened to have been the favorite child of hers. But it was difficult. Food was not plentiful. There was disease. It was a difficult time.
Cries often broke the silence of the night in the streets of the ghetto. Some died of disease, some committed suicide. The war was still on. Chinese and Jewish refugees living in the ghetto started to share secrets. Some refugees helped the Chinese to fight against the Japanese. Some made bombs. However, if caught, the penalties were harsh.
One man that all the refugees knew about was arrested because he was thought to be in the resistance, and he was beaten very badly by the Japanese. And then he was put in jail, he was beaten very badly by the Japanese, and then they just left him on the street.
In fact, Chinese living in the area were even worse off than the Jews.
Badly, very bad. They treated the Chinese people worse than they treated us. When you cross the bridge, Garden Bridge, you know, the Garden Bridge across the Suzhou Creek, yeah. Chinese people walked by there. There was a Japanese guard standing on Garden Bridge. They had to bow. Every Chinese went by had to bow before a Japanese soldier.
They were terrible, terrible to the Chinese. And we could see that. They were very bad to the Chinese, and we always felt sorry for the Chinese who could not really do anything about it.
Living at 96 Huashan Lu is an old gentleman who was the neighbor of many Jews. Now, at the age of 92, he is hospitalized. For the Chinese, those days in the Shanghai ghetto were also heartrending. Mr. Chen contacted volunteers from the Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum, hoping that they could help record the lives and stories of the Jews he remembers. He tells us what Shanghai people of the time thought about their Jewish neighbors. Mr. Chen says life was very hard, full of illness and food shortages. But the Chinese and the Jews helped each other get through the difficult days.
他们做什么生意呢？做裁缝也有，做木匠也有，做医师也有，那么做理发店也有，都有做生意的。前面花园派是后面花园，所以外国人做生意很勤俭的，不管你什么生意都要做。中国人做生意也不管，他们做生意也不管，做各回各做。
Evelyn's mother was one of the hard-working Jews that Mr. Chen remembers.
She took the path to get out of the ghetto, and she went into the city proper, I don't know which section of the city of Shanghai, and she bought up things like belts, sunglasses, scarves, small things, and she put them into the toolbox, bring it back into the ghetto. She'd give it to the peddlers on Tongshan Road, and they would sell whatever, and it didn't bring in much money, but it put us about half a step above starvation level, I guess.
In the fall of 1943, 2 years after her family arrived, Betty drew a card for her father's 50th birthday. The 8-paneled cartoon showed Betty's father's life, his birth, his marriage, and their days from Germany to Shanghai. The last is a family portrait, a family of 4 with nobody left behind. The 13-year-old girl put her heart into drawing a place that was 8,000 miles away from Berlin, their new home in Shanghai. In 1944, a growing number of Jewish teenagers stopped going to school. Instead, they were trying to make money to buy food.
So I got the job of delivering the bread to the people for 2-3 hours in the morning, and for that I got an extra half a loaf. So now I had 1 full loaf, 2 halves, 1 whole. And I could exchange, I could sell the half a loaf for something else, for some vegetable or some eggs or for something else to eat, or cigarettes or something. So that was my way of earning a little more money.
The Oil Moishe Synagogue became the refugees' spiritual home and sustenance. They held gatherings here to pray for an early end to the war. But the situation continued to worsen. Then came the winter of 1944. The refugees had sold their heavy clothes in the summer to buy food, so they were short of food and garments at wintertime. Many died of hunger, cold, and disease. Being isolated in the ghetto, the Jewish refugees struggled with hunger, disease, and death. They endured life this way for 3 years. Until one day in the summer of 1945, the bread delivery boy, Michael Blumenthal, suddenly found that the Japanese guards had disappeared.
The Japanese soldiers were gone all of a sudden. They weren't around anymore. They were hiding. I don't know where they were. So it's really over, it's really over. And then we heard on the radio, and within a few days, the first airplane arrived with some British and American advance guard coming to talk to us, bring food and so forth.
Well, it was very quiet out there. All the Japanese had disappeared. And we realized then, we found out through the radio that the war was over. And it was a sense of freedom, definitely. Singing, dancing, kissing everybody, you know, being happy.
Happy, very happy. One big party, non-stop party.
On August 15th, 1945, Japan announced its unconditional surrender. The Jewish refugees were free again. They thought it was time to go back home. They could not wait to contact their friends and relatives. But then terrible news began arriving.
We started hearing about our relatives who had been killed in Germany.
They all got murdered. My mother figured between 60 to 80 members of our extended family got murdered.
Nearly all of them, except for 2 or 3, were murdered by the Nazis in the camps and the ghettos of Europe. After the age of 9, I never had grandparents or uncles and aunts anymore, except for 1 or 2.
However, on the opposite side of death is birth. Records show that over 400 Jewish babies were born in Shanghai during the war. Shanghai babies. Sonia is one of them. Even today, Shanghai is the place of birth shown on her passport.
If someone look at my passport, even if I came to Shanghai at the airport, those Chinese soldiers are looking at my passport. They see Shanghai, they watch me, and I show them that I have no Chinese eyes, and then they smile. There are my
In March 1939, Sonia was not yet born. Her pregnant mother arrived in Shanghai after a month at sea and gave birth to Sonia in October. The now 76-year-old Sonia is very famous among Jewish refugees in Germany. In the last 15 years, she's been organizing a name list of Jewish refugees in Shanghai.
I'll try to find him in our list, but you told me already years old. In 1944, I found 56 people with the same name, Schlesinger. And you told me that
Sonia has put together a detailed e-document that lists the family information of over 14,000 people. She typed it in all by herself.
From the very beginning, the original list was in my hands. I got a very deep feeling, because all the names I have seen, there were some people, they died already, and they woke up in front of my eyes. And I was very much excited.
Based on Sonia's list, the Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum built this memorial wall. It was unveiled in September 2014. There are 13,732 names on the wall. Decades passed. Sonia's list finally provided a clear proof of this history.
Most of them are very, very happy and thankful, most of them. For example, I've got emails from a professor from France, and he went to the Shanghai Jewish Museum and he has seen the wall, and he asked me to use the names.
Because of missing historical data, it might be impossible ever to find out the complete name list of Shanghai's Jewish refugees. But one thing is certain. What seemed the worst choice at the beginning turned out to be the key to their survival.
Look at this picture. And this woman is Betty, and she just fled from Nazi-dominated areas to Shanghai in 1939. And at that time, she was a really young girl.
After the Japanese surrender, those who survived were full of passion for a new life. In 1948, when Betty was working for the U.S. Navy in Shanghai, she met a handsome young man at a swimming pool.
I walked into the swimming pool, and I had long red hair at the time, and my husband liked red hair. So he offered to teach me how to dive. Well, I wasn't a very good swimmer, but I said, of course, because he was very handsome, so I decided I would. And I didn't drown that day, and we got together very quickly.
The Jewish girl who fled to Shanghai to save her life found her love in the city after 10 years of life in exile. An identical wedding photo is preserved by Betty's son, Peter, who lives with his family in New Jersey in the U.S. It's on a chest that Betty bought before she left China. The Chinese-style cabinet is now a treasure for Betty's family.
And it has now become a family heirloom, which you're not allowed to sell it.
No, I'm very proud to have that.
In February 2015, Michael Blumenthal returned to Shanghai for the 8th time, and again he visited the Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum. In 1973, as the president of the National Committee on United States-China Relations, Michael Blumenthal led a delegation to visit China when China and the United States had just opened their bilateral ties. He went to Beijing, Xi'an, Qingdao, and finally Shanghai. That was the first time he came back. He went back to 59 Zhoushan Road and found everything very familiar.
I took all my colleagues from the National Committee on a walk. We walked around and we looked at all the old places. I showed them where I had grown up, where I had gone to school, where I lived, and so forth. So that was my first visit. Physically, it looked like the way I remembered it. Not many, some buildings in the Russian style on Nanjing Shilu, you know, which used to be called Qing'ezelu, was a different name. There was a big building that had been built that looked like a Russian building in Moscow. A few buildings like that, but basically no rickshaws, no wampatsos. Rickshaws were gone, lots of bicycles, very few cars. See, hard for you to imagine now that you've got traffic jams in Shanghai. Very few cars. So when they had the rickshaw,
He said that although he's 90 now, he still wants to bring his wife with him to revisit the place where he used to live. While Blumenthal was visiting Shanghai, Sonia, who's now in Germany, was also expecting a long-awaited reunion.
They will arrive, no problem at all.
You have waited for 70 years.
For 70 years, right.
So the 5 minutes, it's just
It's like nothing.
like nothing.
Like nothing, yes.
In 1946, 7-year-old Sonia and her brother Peter took this picture in Shanghai. The other two girls in the picture were the twin sisters from the Bayer family. After the victory in the war, the four childhood friends became separated. Today is their first reunion in 70 years.
You were gefallen. I told them you are short as I am.
Can you get down that far?
I'm in your arms. So, time is much better than it was.
1, 2, 3,
You know, okay.
1, 2, 3, go!
Time froze at this moment, as if it were 70 years ago.
Anyway, you make a very long rope, and then one person holds it on that side, and one person holds it,
And then
and
you
raise
raise it higher. And you jump.
and then it goes up.
Isendago, yaseningo, eyo hakado, aro baro, nipponkai, aidai shai.
Remembering their childhood in Shanghai, they started to sing a nursery rhyme, just as they had 70 years ago. 70 years have passed since the end of the war. Driven by an invisible force, people around the world look back at history in their own ways.
Ich möchte jetzt ein großartiges Projekt zeigen. Ach, da ist ja einer, ein Stolperstein. Es gibt verschiedene Orte, zum Beispiel jetzt hier in der Gegend muss sie gewohnt haben, da man für sie hier diesen Stolperstein gelegt hat. Es ist ein fantastisches Projekt, um an Menschen zu erinnern, an Nachbarn zu erinnern.
On the streets of Berlin, these protruding stones are everywhere. Each stone has a bronze plate with the name of a Jewish victim who was killed or deported by the Nazis. These stones are to remind people of what happened in this country and of those who suffered here.
If you save one life, you save the world.